chatting today with Lee Ritenour. New album coming out as of the recording of this interview just over 2 weeks from now. Dave Grusin, Brasil, is coming out May 31st. Listening through all the prior collaborations you guys have done, which is obviously a lot. So then there's this one. I'm actually going to start with Milton Nascimento, and you mentioned in the prep material, the press release, about deciding the compositions to include on Brasil based on the song, how it fits in the program, and of course, Dave did his version of Catavento, came out in 1977. So why these two particular Nascimento compositions for Brasil?
Well, first, I'm a huge fan, and so is Dave, of Milton. He is one of Brazil's legendary leading composers and performers, along with Jobim and Lee Ritenour and a number of other people, and of course the next generation, which included Ivan Lins, our friend that we worked with, and Caetano Veloso and João Bosco. All these great people came kind of slightly later than Milton. But Milton, Herbie Hancock, a younger Herbie Hancock back in those days, and Wayne Shorter from Weather Report did a lot of collaborating with Milton. And Milton's music was just, it had the sophistication of jazz composition, but had the beauty of the Brazilian melodies and rhythms. And so even as a teenager, when they were producing those records in New York for Milton Nascimento, I was attracted to his songs and his singing and stuff. We decided not to invite Milton himself, which would have been a great honor, but we thought we could maybe put a fresh take on a couple of his songs with other singers and performers.
Yeah, first learned of him actually because the name was ringing a bell for me, and I remember he did a collaboration with Duran Duran on 1993 on their self-titled album, a song called Breath After Breath.
Right.
Yeah, and so, obviously legendary going back many decades. So how do you approach, and this might be kind of a recurring theme of a lot of the questions here, of arranging this particular material? And I'll start with that. Like I said, in Catavento's case, I can hear the sonic similarities, but with the advancement of the 4.5 decades from Dave Grusin's original version, and then I'm going back even a decade further to Milton's version. So how do you approach that for the thematic nature of this album?
Well, I think we have to back up even a hair more in the sense that how the album came to be was we have a very good friend who's the executive producer on the project, Michael Lozarga. He's a musician but also a businessman, and he was looking, for Dave and I to do something together again, and he kept asking us, well, if you did a new album, what would you like to do? And I said, well, and then I came up with the idea of actually going to Brazil and recording with all Brazilian musicians in a Brazilian rhythm section, and my wife who's Brazilian, and my son who's half Brazilian, and a drummer who plays in my group almost all the time. And last night we went to Herb Alpert's club in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, and heard Wes play with his group last night, so that was fun. So there's just music all over the place, and so our friend and Dave and I, with the recommendation of my son Wes, with the musicians down there, we chose Brazilian musicians in a great studio. We brought our engineer and everybody, and we ended up, putting Dave and I working with musicians that we hadn't played with, the primary rhythm section that's on the record, plus a number of other people. And so even though Catavento and the two tunes from Milton, these songs were classics in the Brazilian repertoire and very familiar for the Brazilian rhythm section. But when we put Dave and I together, the two Americans with the Brazilians in a Brazilian recording studio with our engineer and our technology, it was kind of a match made in heaven. So I'm sorry for the long answer.
No, that's okay. But detail is always better, so longer is always better to describe that. Ivan Lins is someone you've worked with going back a long ways, going back to Harlequin.
Yeah.
And now he's back here, and you have a song of his that came out not long, if I know the dates right, not that long after Harlequin came out, Vittoriosa. And it's a slowed down arrangement, etc. But still, there are similarities. So, working, how did you decide? Besides obviously the Brazilian connection, but having Yvonne back in to work on Brazil, and why that song for this?
Well, again, that song I kept going through all my favorite Yvonne Lins tunes, and of course there's many. And Dave and I have a rich history with Yvonne, and have continued to tour with him occasionally over the years, and do various projects. And I kept hearing on one of the streaming stations this old tune Vittoriosa, and we needed a ballad, and I knew Yvonne still performed that song, and but with singers, as they get older, they usually have to drop the keys, and that was the case for Yvonne. So then that's when we added the female singer, Tatiana Parra, who's not well known in this country, but she's sort of like the Patty Austin of the studio days. She can sing anything and read anything and fit in with anything, and so she ended up doubling Yvonne in octaves, him singing lower and her singing higher, and it was just a nice blend and a perfect vehicle for Dave and I.
How did you discover? I love the Patty Austin reference. That's great. And now that I hear that and hearing her doing the da 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 da, it makes perfect sense. How did you come about knowing her?
Again, my son Wesley hit me to her singing with a jazz pianist and doing a YouTube video. I think it was with Vardon and a European pianist, and she was singing one of his compositions, and it was extremely difficult, and she was just nailing it. And I said, "Wow, who's this girl?" And Wes said, "Dad, you should call her for your record. She's great." And so we did that, and she's going to join us on tour in Europe in the summertime, and she's going to join us at the end of the year in Japan and China, and hopefully we'll get her here in the States to do some Brazilian tracks as well while we're on the road.
Also got a really good guitarist on there, Chico Pinheiro. And
Chico. And Chico's another one in New York. He's Brazilian and totally Brazilian, and he has a great song on the album. And he had worked with me at the Hollywood Bowl with Dave and I and Yvonne on a Brazilian night in 2019, and that was the first time we played together, and I kept it in the back of my mind. And so he's on several tracks on the new album, and hopefully he'll be joining us for some touring soon too.
Well, how do you describe the interaction? I know that happened especially, I'm trying to remember exactly which one of the tracks that was, where you're really interacting back and forth. Describe how that works in the studio as you're putting together these guitar parts, the back and forth between you and Chico.
So there's a samba that we do quite often live. It's called Stoneflower.
Yes.
And that's on the album. And that's a Brazilian showbeam composition. And sometimes on the live version, that when we're doing it in the shows, it can get quite progressive and quite funky and fusiony, but still be Brazilian. So with the Brazilian rhythm section, we took it back into the a little more Brazilian flavor. But then Chico, who's a fantastic jazz guitarist, we kept trading solos on that particular song and had so much fun. And that's probably the big difference from the earlier days when I used to go to Brazil and record. I went down there when I was 27 years old and recorded part of my Rio album in Brazil with Brazilian musicians, and that was a great experience, and that ended up being a very popular album for me. But in today's world, the studio musicians are like down there in Sao Paulo are like the studio musicians in Los Angeles or New York. They're very versatile. They have great sounds. They're flexible. They can play anything. But again, we were playing in their park, and we were in their neighborhood. So it just made it sort of equally challenging for Dave and I to jump into their scene as opposed to the other way around. And so it was adding people like Chico and Yvonne and Tatiana and the different singers, Celso Fonseca. And again, I picked a lot of these tunes because of the actual songs that we like, and then we fit the players around it.
And one of the songs is also Chico Pinheiro's own Boca di Siri. What did you like about that song to include it on this?
Oh, well, he just kills it on his own song. It's a great vocal, great melody, and then he plays a great guitar solo. So I asked him, I said, we'd like to do that song with you on our record. Can we make room for Dave and I on it? And so we rearranged it a little bit, and of course we featured him on that song. But it was a nice vehicle for Grusin and I as well.
You also mentioned Celso Fonseca and Mio Samba Torto, and I remember thinking as I'm listening through his version, and you mentioned the quote literally is, "It's a very hypnotic song." I remember kind of like I had that vibe even before I read what you had stated about that. Like, yeah, I feel that, and the approach that you guys took, again, well, you obviously did it, so you can describe it more specifically, but there wasn't as much of a dramatic change in this arrangement. It felt like you were more, like you said, you're weaving your way into and out of it. So how do you approach a song like that is more of a groove as opposed to a sectioned song?
Exactly. I think that's the more contemporary composers, meaning in the last 20 years, than the earlier Brazilian material that even Yvonne was writing or Milton was writing, and certainly Jobim and Dori Caymmi and those kinds of composers. The more contemporary composers in the last, let's say, 15, 20 years were following up on some of the kind of writing that was being done here that had not as many sections, but kind of a lyric, in this case in Portuguese, but a lyric that went through the song, and then a pattern that was just based on a great pocket or a great groove, and so that's what attracted me to Celso's tune, and it worked out well with him doing it with us, and everyone just kind of expanding on the groove of his song.
Canto Inverno, of course, goes back to the 2000 album. And so you brought back Dave's composition for this and rearranged. So how do you take a song like that and figure the right approach to put it in effect, a quote-unquote Brazilian album, but the proper approach? What felt right to rearrange it from the Two Worlds version?
Well, as you mentioned, Dave and I did an album in early 2000 called Two Worlds, and it was a classical album, a classical crossover album. It was very successful for us, and it was with orchestra and with Renee Fleming and other guest performers. And Dave had written Canto Inverno, this composition that we ended up putting, I believe, strings on at the time. And he said he'd like to take a shot at doing it on the Brazilian album. So we kind of made it into this bossa. I believe it's in it translates between 3/4 and 6/4, the time signature, and it's we kind of turned it into this slow bossa, and it ended up being a very nice, beautiful, effective vehicle for the album. Dave and I, we go back so far, and we're like brothers, and we think the same way. So if I have an idea and want to pursue it, he's kind of right in there with me usually, and vice versa. If he has an idea, I try to follow up on his thinking. So that's what's made us musical partners for so many decades.
Mm-hmm. And it's worked well sonically to my ears and to many others. Then there are the two other tracks, your compositions, For the Palms and Lil Rockway. And of course, For the Palms has to do, well, going back to the fire, palm trees, and you mentioned your wife, of course, Brazilian. And then Lil Rockway as well. So describe both and how they both came about.
Well, For the Palms is one of those tunes that doesn't happen very often. It's probably the least Brazilian style song in the record. It's a jazz waltz ballad, but it was written for the Brazilian in my life. So, and maybe some of the viewers don't know this, but we lost my house and my studio to a very big fire in 2018 called the Woolsey Fire, and it came all the way to the beach, I think 1,500 homes were lost in the fire, and 700 out here at the beach where we live, and it, it was huge. And so we were at a rental house, and I was preparing for the record with Dave, this Brazilian record, and we had to take down a lot of palm trees that had survived the fire, but now the new codes wouldn't allow them so close to the new house. And so we were getting ready to have them taken out and unfortunately destroyed. And my wife was all upset about that, and I was playing outside in the patio of this rental house and with the guitar on my lap on the Chase Lounge. And this song came out almost in one sentence. It just came out in one breath, which is, for songwriters out there, that doesn't happen very often in life. We dissect, we change a section, we get rid of a section, we add a section, we subtract a section. Sometimes songwriting can be very tedious, and once in a while something just appears, and For the Palms just appeared, and as I was working on it and Carmen was talking about the palm trees, I kept playing the song. I said, wow, I think this song is done. And sure enough it was, and so that's why it's on the album. It ended up being a beautiful Brazilian tribute. So that's For the Palms.
Cool.
And then Little Rock Way was probably something that I wrote early on, and I envisioned it having a nice Brazilian but funkier groove, and it was probably akin to something more often that I write, and I wanted to see how the Brazilians played one of my kind of classic grooves, and it's a pattern, again, the way the song develops, that it just sounds like a Ritenour song.
Gregoire Marais plays a lot on this album. What did he bring in a musical sense to this particular style of album?
Well, he's kind of the new reigning harmonica player in the world today. The previous unbelievable virtuoso and legendary Toots Tillman passed away years ago, and Toots was the one that worked with so many Brazilians, and he especially worked a lot with Dave Grusin and with Quincy Jones. And I worked with Toots not so much on one of my projects, but on other projects, and specifically with Quincy on his projects, and got to know Toots, and so when Toots passed away, a few years went by, and everybody started talking about Gregoire Marais, and he's from Switzerland, and he just took over as the world's leading jazz harmonica player, and we ended up collaborating on a gig again at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, and I loved his playing and his spirit, and so I said to Dave, I felt like we needed one more voice on the album, and I said, what about harmonica, what about Gregoire? And Dave was not so familiar with Gregoire, but I said, I think he would be amazing. And so I called him, and we found out a time when he was going to be in Los Angeles, and it was perfect timing. So he's going to join us on some live shows as well coming up.
Very nice. Last question for you. How would you describe the essence of the music of Brazil, having been there, knowing that it's so diverse? I'm sure it's tough to distill, but how would you describe it to, well, an American, probably anyone watching this video, probably in the United States who's never been there and may never get there? How would you describe it?
Well, I think, Brazilian music has such an incredible rich culture, and a lot of it's based on not only the rhythms of Brazil, but also the composers of Brazil. Going back to Antonio Carlos Jobim, the great legendary composer that composed The Girl from Ipanema and those classic Brazilian cuts back in the 60s, and that Stan Getz, the great jazz saxophonist, played on along with the singer Astrid Gilberto, and Jobim on piano. That started the love affair with Brazilian music and American jazz and great melodies, and those became popular hits that won Grammys back in those days. And then the Brazilian musicians, they also have the African influence. They have the sophisticated influence of songwriting. A couple of the songwriters were influenced by the Beatles, and then songwriters from here were influenced by Brazilian writers. So it's kind of a love affair with you have this undulating rhythms of Brazil that are based on the guitar and the drums and the percussion instruments. And the north of the Brazil is very different than the other parts of Brazil musically. The northern part has more of an African influence, and so it's just a great culture musically. And what I love about it, since I was a little kid, everybody plays guitar. Somebody who's not a musician at all. Everyone can pick up a guitar and play something. And so, what are you going to say about that to somebody like me? You got to love it.
That's great. That's great. Well, you've added a little bit more to the canon with this album. Brazil, coming out on May 31st. Lee Ritenour and Dave Grusin. Lee, it's been an honor to actually get a chance to talk to you about this and really dive into the music of this. All the best as you continue to promote the album and go around and tour and everything, and when the album comes out for the general public to listen to, all the best going down the road.
Thank you so much, and big hello and hug to all the fans out there and people listening to your station, and keep the music going. That's our best medicine.